Okay, so I want to talk today about something called the Data, Information, Knowledge, Wisdom Pyramid. You can see that there. This is not my idea, by the way, I have to say. It's been around for a while. But the idea is that you start with data, you add some value, you get some information from which you derive knowledge, and then finally wisdom. So that's the idea. So I'm going to take you on a ladder, if you like. So what's the difference between information, knowledge, and wisdom? Well, okay, let's use the tomato as an example. So data about the tomato could be, well, it's red, and it's kind of round, and the green thing at the top, it looks like it grows from a plant. So this could technically be data. Information is knowing what a tomato actually is. Knowledge could be, you know that it originates from South America, and that the tomato is a fruit. This is knowledge. But wisdom is knowing you should never put a tomato in a fruit salad. This is wisdom. Now, Google and other search engines, these are systems. These are systems that are masters of information. If you type into any search engine, what's the best restaurant in Edinburgh, you're going to get a long list of candidates, right? But what if you wanted to type in to get something a little bit deeper, a little bit of knowledge, like how do you open a successful restaurant in Edinburgh? The results that you get from a search engine are usually not quite so straightforward. And this is all linked to this pyramid. Now, I work for the European Space Agency. I am an engineer. I worked in Earth observation future missions. So we design satellites that look at the Earth, and I've done that for the last 14 years. And since September, I've moved. Now, I still work at the European Space Agency, but I work at the European Commission in research and innovation, so I'm based in Brussels. And while I was preparing for this talk, I typed into Google, do you get wisdom from satellites? And this is what I got. It turns out, and I did not know this, it turns out that there's a town in Montana with a population size of 118. So this is wisdom, according to Google. Now, we know inherently as human beings that wisdom is not the same as information, is not the same, it's not the same as knowledge, it's not the same as information. One definition says that wisdom is information plus knowledge plus context. And really, when you start talking about context, only really humans can do that, at least for now. Another definition is that wisdom is information plus knowledge that you can actually use. And you can use this information based on your own experience. But like the tomato in the fruit salad, this can also be rather subjective. Because, I mean, what if you like tomatoes in your fruit salad? Maybe, I don't know. So wisdom is also rather subjective. One person's crazy is another person's wisdom. So you have to kind of bear that in mind. I like this quote that says, knowledge comes from learning, but wisdom comes from living. And this is why it's so difficult to nail down exactly what wisdom is, because living is messy. Now, I work with satellites every single day, and satellites, they fly around the Earth. They provide data and information about the Earth system. Now, in future missions where I worked, we look at the Earth as a system. Everything is connected. So we design satellites that measure things about oceans and land, forest fires, deserts, everything. Now, this data gets sent back down to Earth, and it gets combined with other data, and this, I would suggest, is where the knowledge starts to build up. And you can use this knowledge to make more informed decisions and also judgments, because if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. Now, in low Earth orbit, this is the classic low Earth orbit. The satellite flies around the Earth. There are many different kinds of orbits, but this is a classic Earth observation orbit. The satellite flies north-south or south-north, depending on how you want to look at it, and the Earth rotates around, which means that this satellite can map virtually the entire globe. So what happens is the satellite flies along its orbit like this, and it's taking measurements and also images as it flies along its orbit. In this kind of orbit, it's traveling at 7,000 meters per second. So that's quite fast. So in one orbit, that's 100 minutes. So it's pretty fast. Now, let me show you this. So this is a strip of information taken by a satellite as it flies along its orbit. It flies over the area of interest, it takes a measurement. Next orbit, flies again, takes more information. Next orbit. And all the information is collected in strips until, let's see how far we go with this. This is a mosaic of the African continent. It was taken by the Sentinel-2A satellite, which you can go online and you can have a look at all the Sentinel images, which are really quite beautiful. This mosaic is made up of over 7,000 different images. 7,000. And it's also cloud-free as well, which is why it took 5 months for this mosaic to be put together. Now, Sentinel-2 provides data and information. You saw it in these strips. But it wasn't until the data gets sent down to Earth and the strips get further processed, and stitched together that you get the knowledge actually starts building up. Now, another example. We use Earth observation in many different ways, and I know we've been talking a lot about Malawi today. We use Earth observation in a lot of different ways. One way is disaster management. Now, typically, we need maps before something happens, hopefully during, while something is happening, and then also after the thing has actually happened so that we can understand the extent of the problem. So I'm going to have a look at Malawi, and particularly in the area just south of Zomba, this area here. So this is an Earth observation map. It's a combination of radar and optical satellite imagery. And this is before, so this is a reference map. And we're going to focus particularly on the area south of the lake. Now, in 2015, Malawi was hit by really bad floods. This is an afterwards, so you can see the extent of the flooding there. And the thing was that people knew about the flooding, but they didn't move. Now, why was that? Because they were using a lot of, they were connected with their ancestral land because their livelihood was based on agriculture. Now, no map from any satellite is going to immediately tell you that on its own. So in order to address disasters like this, and also make more informed decisions and longer-term solutions, you need also local knowledge as well, and an understanding of people. And when you're talking about people, it means that you have to understand things like behavior and culture and context and economics and history. And this, I would suggest, is where the idea of wisdom comes. This is the messy part. Now, let me just turn my page. So we have another example. Another example of a European Space Agency project. This took place in the Gambia. Now, Gambia is the smallest country on mainland Africa, and you can see the shape of Gambia is kind of a long, very particular shape. And you can see that we've had some radar and optical satellites that have mapped the entire country of the Gambia using radar and optical satellites together, but focusing on agriculture mapping and also land cover mapping. Now, This was a trial that was done with the European Space Agency as well as the United Nations International Fund for Agriculture Development. Now, this particular project, it focused on how the land changed from year to year. And it focused particularly on the rural communities close to the river for sustainable rice production. The idea was also to monitor and measure vegetation growth and be able to differentiate between different crop types. So this information and knowledge that came from the satellites was taken even further, and training was set up for local technicians to collect data on the ground so they could compare it with the satellite data. And also there was training for local government representatives as well. And this mapping was actually used in evidence in political dialogue and helped to trigger more investment in smallholder agriculture. So in terms of the pyramid, you could say for this that data is the image of the field. Information may be knowing when the satellite data was actually taken, so you have a better understanding of the growth cycle. Now, knowledge could be, you could apply some computer programs, for example, to understand things like soil moisture and the level of nutrients in the soil, for example. But maybe wisdom is knowing when to apply these nutrients and fertilizers in the soil. So this is actually information that you can use. Now here is another example of a European Space Agency initiative. It's called TIGER, and it's been going now for over a decade, and it focuses on water resource management in Africa. And there's been a lot of different projects across 42 different African countries. And work continues with 150 African water authorities and research institutes. One example, we look at N'Djamena in Chad. This is a satellite image, lots of different kinds of satellite image all overlaid on here. And this is used to estimate current and future water demand. And it's used by the local government sanitation department to better prioritize maintenance and resources. Now, I work in Earth observation, but I cannot ignore telecommunications. There's been a number of projects and talks today talking about telecommunications. Now, as people have said already, in the next few years, there's going to be increasing amounts of telecommunication satellites that will be launched, which means that there will be much cheaper, more accessible ways to access robust Wi-Fi. And coupled to this, people also, particularly in Africa, have more access to smartphones. So then, as we've already said today, that it lets people have access to a whole raft of new applications, like money management and e-training and voting, etc. Now, something that ESA is very committed to in Africa in particularly, but also globally, is education. Now, we have a lot of different projects focused on education, particularly in Africa. But many of the projects which I found interesting go further than just the provision of the Wi-Fi or the broadband or whatever. And they actually do twinning activities of schools in Africa and in Europe. And for example, this picture, this is a project. They take rural schools in South Africa and rural Italy, and they twin them. And so the idea is that they can actually exchange education, cultural, and also linguistic experiences. And there's an effort to develop partnerships between African countries and European ones to establish scalable and sustainable services. Now, another application which has been touched on today is mobile money. And for me, this was something new that I hadn't really seen before. And as I'm sure many of you know, mobile money is when you transfer money from mobile phone to mobile phone. Now, one example that when I was doing research for this talk, I thought was actually quite a nice example of what I wanted to talk about was a company called, or a scheme called M-Pesa. Now, this isn't a European Space Agency initiative at all. It's just something I thought was interesting. M-Pesa was started over 10 years ago in Kenya. I'm sure that many of you know about this. There was an article in The Economist that said it's actually easier now to pay for a cab in downtown Nairobi than it is to pay for a cab in New York, thanks to mobile money. And I thought that was really interesting. Now, M-Pesa was actually used to facilitate microfinance loans using pay-as-you-go mobile phone plans. But it became clear that the service was going to be used in a different way. And one story that I heard, I can't verify it, but I like the anecdote, that there was a husband waiting for a bus in a bus station in Nairobi, and he got his money stolen. And his wife, using the mobile phone, transferred him his bus fare so he could get home. And when I read this, I thought this was fantastic, because this thief will never know that he unwittingly started a money transfer revolution. Now, armed with all of these anecdotal pieces of evidence, there were a number of telecommunications satellites that started working on this. And one telecommunication company came up with the idea of send money home, because it was realized that in Kenya, many of the people would send money back to their local town or local village where their family were. Up until that point, they would actually send cash in heavily disguised parcels on the bus, or they would give cash to the people on the bus going that way. I mean, this is super risky. So the idea of mobile money, at least from my point of view, lessens this risk. So for me, this took local knowledge to actually understand the culture and the behavior of the local people to create a commercial idea which could be used on the ground. And for me, this takes a little bit of wisdom. It's also actually an example of how satellites can solve problems that you don't even realize existed as well, which is often the case. Now, that's the mobile money slide, should have known it. All right, so there's also many different applications which I've touched on, and they use many different kinds of satellites. We have Earth observation satellites, which is my area of expertise. We look at telecommunications satellites, and there's also global navigation satellites. And they all orbit the Earth, all working together. Now, one project I'd like to highlight, this is an ESA project, and this uses all these different kinds of satellites, so telecommunications, global navigation, and Earth observation. BeLife is a mobile diagnostic facility, and it aims at speedy diagnosis of pathogens like Ebola. I know that we got a question this morning about Ebola. And this includes a mobile inflatable tent, you can see that in the top corner, specialized equipment to analyze biological samples, and also an inflatable satellite antenna. So, and in fact, BeLife was deployed in Guinea during the Ebola outbreak a couple of years ago. It uses telecommunications to connect the site to other sites that have greater computing power so that they can analyze the samples much quicker. And global navigation to actually track the samples, equipment, and people in the field. And then Earth observation satellites they can use for site selection, something like that. This is an Earth observation satellite image, and something with a little bit higher resolution. What the team did was go even further, and actually they've produced a demo web platform. So you can see the overlay of the Earth observation satellites, but they've taken on-the-ground information, and they've color-coded them. So you can see that the areas around the unit, now the BeLife unit is the red balloon in the center, and you can see that the different colors represent the number of Ebola infections that have been confirmed. And if we look down at the southeast, the area that I've highlighted there, you can see that 26 patients were examined and 52 Ebola infections were actually confirmed, with 7 malaria infections also confirmed. So this, I think, is a good example of showing that you take satellite data and information and integrating it together, you can get some more knowledge. So in future missions, where I've worked for the last 14 years, we design satellite concepts which provide data on things like the oceans and the land, polar regions, forests, forest fires, everything. Even fire alarms, no, I'm kidding. And when you do this kind of work, you realize that absolutely everything is connected, and in fact the Earth is a system. Every town, every country, every continent is connected. We share the same ground, we share the same water and the same air. And this is why satellites are just so important, because they give us a perspective that we can't get any other way, a global perspective. Satellites are designed by people, for people, to provide information that ultimately they can use, which is where I suspect the wisdom lies. But if we're striving for wisdom, then surely it's in our humanity where we can make the most difference. I like this quote from Eleanor Roosevelt that said, "Never mistake knowledge for wisdom. One helps you make a living, and the other helps you make a life." Thank you very much.